Hello everyone, this is your instructor Dr. Sylvia Seal. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about Chapter 5, Perception. The main purpose of this video is to just touch on three things: distinguishing between sensation and perception, as it's often misunderstood. Secondly, to identify some examples of bottom-up and top-down processing. And finally, to identify each major sensory system. Let's start by defining what sensation is and we can determine how you can differentiate sensation from perception. Now, sensation is input of sensory information. So that's input that you get from your senses, and we're going to briefly touch about what those senses are. So it's a process of receiving, converting, and transmitting information from the outside world. And we'll look at some really good examples as we briefly go through this particular presentation. Now, examples of our sensory systems are vision and hearing and taste, smell. You know how when you walk into a bakery, the first thing you can smell is that aroma of freshly baked goods. So that's your senses. That's what you're perceiving. You're sensing something. Things that we don't often consider as sensory systems are things like balance, even though it's sensory. Balance, kinesthesis, which is your body movement, and of course touch, pressure, pain, temperature. So those are basically sensory systems. So when you think about sensation, think about how you perceive that outside world through your senses. So that's what sensation really is. Now, let's look at what perception is on the other hand. Perception, the textbook says, is a subjective interpretation of that sensory information. So once you get that sensory information, now perception happens now in the brain, where you're now interpreting that sensory information. So that's what the textbook says. Another good definition is what I have right here: a constructive process by which we can go beyond the stimuli that are presented to us and attempt to construct a meaningful situation. So whatever you get from that stimuli or from those outside senses, then you're trying to make a meaningful interpretation in your brain. So that's one of the big differences between perception and sensation. Now, I would like to briefly look at this. Now, this is a really great example of a visual representation of what sensation is and what perception is and what happens. So with sensation, the stimulus energy, or whatever the stimuli that you're receiving, anything from touch, anything from smell, all those senses that we just mentioned, once you get that, in this example I think this is coffee brewing, you can smell that. You can, you listen to the sound when the coffee machine is done. All your senses are at work. Your sensory receptors receive them. Your eyes can see the coffee. Your ears can hear the sound. Your nose can perceive the smell, etc. And now it sends it now over through your impulses, through those nerves. This is not a biology class, but it's good to see how it all works. It goes through the nerves inside the neural impulses, and of course then it lands in the brain. Now the brain is where all the magic works. That's where perception starts. When you have received all that information, how your brain is now interpreting all of this information is your perception. So I hope this is a great example of, or a visual representation of, the difference between perception and sensation. So that when I do ask you to give me the difference between these two, this should be something that you should always think about. Sensation is about receiving from those senses, meanwhile perception has to do with those processes that are synthesizing in your brain after trying to interpret or give a meaningful interpretation of what you actually received. And going now to education, how can you interpret this in education? When you receive information through whatever stimuli, what you perceive is based on what you receive. So if you are constantly reading a certain textbook or going over something over and over based on the letters or however you want to interpret it, your perception of that thing will be the way you receive it through those sensory receptors. Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? Things like that. So that's how you can now interpret it in education. Let's look at an example. Now, when we look at top-down, and when we mention, the book mentions top-down and bottom-down perception, or processing, sorry. While our sensory receptors are constantly collecting that information from the environment, it is ultimately how we interpret that information that affects how we interact with the world. So that's what we talked about, perception. So perception again refers to the way sensory information is organized, interpreted, and consciously experienced. Perception involves both bottom-up and top-down processing. Bottom-up processing refers to the fact that when perceptions are built from sensory input, those are the perceptions built from sensory input. On the other hand, when we interpret those sensations, it's influenced by our available knowledge, our experiences, and our thoughts. This is called top-down processing. Let's look at a good example. Look at the shape in figure 1, this shape. When you just look at it alone, your brain engages in bottom-up processing, because you're just looking at this without any context. You're just looking at what does this mean to you, and you send it to your brain, and your brain is trying to interpret that. Your brain can say, well, there are 2 thick lines, vertical lines, and 3 thin horizontal lines. There is no context to give in a specific meaning. So that is what, there is no top-down processing, it's only bottom-up. It's what you see as a stimuli and your brain trying to interpret it. Now, when you look at the same shape in 2 different contexts, then that's when your perception will be a little bit different, because now you have context. So if you surround the letters with, let's say with sequential letters, your brain expects the shape to be a letter, and to complete the sequence, A, B, C. So now your brain will say, oh, this is a B in this context. And you might perceive that, oh, the lines were actually trying to form a C. So that's an example of top-down processing. Now, when you surround it with numbers, same thing. It looks like a 13. This context will tell you it's a 13. So context is an important thing when it comes to perception. When given a context, your perception is driven by cognitive expectations. Now you are processing the shape in a top-down fashion. Okay, so context is a big thing. So I hope this really helps us understand the difference between top-down and bottom-up processing. I know another good example is, let's say you're walking into a kitchen like we saw in that example, and you smell the scent of baking cinnamon rolls. The sensation is the scent receptors detecting the odor of cinnamon, but the perception may be, this smells like bread Grandma used to bake when family gathered for the holidays. So although our perceptions are built from sensations, not all sensations result in perceptions. Okay, so that's what I wanted to briefly touch on, the difference between sensation and perception. And I hope you can use this as a great reminder of, okay, when you're trying to differentiate those things, this will stick better with you. I'm also giving this resource for those who said they were visual learners. I think this will really work help you. So I hope this is helpful. If you have a question about this, send it to our course questions discussion board. All right, see you.